Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in June 2021. We have a very interesting session today with Nicolas, who's actually going to show a project that he's been working on a kind of a mix of security awareness, gameplay, interactive session, where he actually, he has a number of a model, so an interesting model of how to set up multiple teams who are kind of working on different scenarios, and then to make them much more aware of the side effects and the security implications of what's going on. So over to you, Nicolas. And I think on this session we're gonna introduce a lot of the concepts, and then we want to run a follow-up session next month where we actually gonna really try to get as many participants as we can, and then really do a nice full-on interactive. So this is almost the intro. So if you I'm watching this in preparation for the session that we're going to run in the next summits. This is the rules and engagements and how everything works. So over to you, Nicolas.
Thanks. So yes, this is a game. This game that would be more akin to, let's say, something you would see coming out of the D&D world, or basically the role-playing game world. It is a card game where you are separated into 4 teams that basically don't interact, which is a departure from a real world scenario where you would still have some interaction between your groups. The 4 teams being a team of developers, a team focused on IT security, a team of managers, and basically a group of threat actors, basically either a ransomware gang or someone else. The point of the game and of keeping everyone separate is that several actions by several teams are going to negatively or positively influence the other teams. And the idea of keeping everyone in their corner is that they can't react preemptively to an action that one team does or doesn't do. That's kind of the concept. So this game being closely related to, let's say, Magic the Gathering or D&D does imply that there is a stats system, but it is a little bit further than your general stats system that you would find in such a game. The first one being Charisma. I mean, this is a little bit closer to role-playing games, but it does have a certain effect on, let's say, cards or tasks that require some interaction, some level of say prestance. SOC, which would then be social media capabilities. This is going to be pretty important on the attacker side or on the manager side, because they'll need to be able to either show off some things like demonstrations, or they'll be able to siphon elements from social media like OSINT, because that is, let's say, a vector that people sometimes forget, is that sometimes some people can find out your password just by looking at your feed. So yeah, that is an element. Then your more core capabilities, which are a development capability, so that is going to be more related to the development team. A security capability, which is going to be very important to the security team, and network capability, which is going to be on both teams. And yeah. So the base idea of the game is that it is a game that does require dice. Dice either being physical dice, such as, for example, this one, it's D20, or virtual. If you Google roll a D20, you're going to have an interactive dice throwing machine. There are a few other websites, eddnd.org is one of them, but there are a lot of websites that allow you to roll dice. And there's, for the moment, 2 types of dice that can be used. A D20, which is a 20-sided die with values going from 1 to 20, which is for everything that goes from checking whether you succeeded in an ability check or succeeded a saving throw against an attack. Or a D4, which is a 4-sided die, which would be used in case of, let's say, a supplementary effect or a duration of time. The pregame is mostly consisted of explanations such as this one, and of building teams. So you would take a certain number of participants, let's say 16 to 20 people maximum, and break them out in 4 groups of 4 to 5 people. These groups would then all go into their respective breakout rooms and roll for their team stats, which is rolling 5 d20s and then assigning them to their base characteristics. If they're not happy with their 5 dice that they rolled, they re-roll their 5 dice. That kind of keeps it live. And then they have some time to strategize with the card deck. The card deck, for the moment, is. I'm now going to go onto GitHub to show you how this is going. All right. So this is supposed to be a website. This is a github.io website. For the moment, it does not host a website because it only has the cards on them, but we'll get to that ready for the next session. A card is resembles, let's say, a normal game, card game card. There we go. In the sense that it, yeah, there we go, is a task. Normally that'd be an image also, but you know, and has a certain score value, which is how much time it would take to do this. And you have a certain number of actions you can do during a turn and a certain requirement. So that kind of gives you a synergistic arc for your development and security teams. On the other hand, such teams such as managers and threat actors are going to be different because what they do is either they buff or they debuff your players. So managers would for example, let's take one at random. My internet speed is not what it used to be. Well, it has never been what it used to be. For example, managers will do a social media campaign, right? And they'll have to roll whether or not what they showed on their social media campaign was, let's say, responsible in terms of security. And if they succeed the role, hey, a sponsor was interested, and let's say a development or security task can be accomplished instantly. So that kind of helps with the flow. If you fail, well, you lose some score or some ability in defending against threat actors. So in this case, it's you either get buffed, or if you fail, you get debuffed. And it's a kind of a card that people are going to need to be, let's say, not use at every turn, because otherwise they might, put themselves in a hole. Finally, you have also, like I said, the debuff type of cards, which are threats, in which case you would see, for example, threats initiating a phishing campaign, where they would try to be charismatic, so that would be their ability check. And if it succeeds, they would gain a +2 to attempting to gain a shell, which is a future card. So they stack up their ability to then cause further damage. So those are some of the various cards. I've given you some examples. There's, for the moment, about 53 cards. That is going to be, let's say, only a portion of the actual card deck once we get all of this rolling. But it is, in fact, let's say, sufficient card deck for a 1 to 2 hour game. The game itself, in this case, in a 1 hour game, would have been 45 minutes, where the session master, that's me, goes from one team to another. And a cycle is expected to take about 4 minutes. And in this cycle, I only follow a very specific order, which is the threat team, the manager team, the development team, and at the end, the security team. And so when I show up, the teams either roll a saving throw if there's an attack going on, or if there's a phishing campaign or something. And otherwise, you play either one card if you're a threat actor or manager, or if you're a security or in dev, you play a number of cards until you run out of action points. You would have 8 action points if you are in development, and 6 action points if you were in security. These are arbitrary numbers that work well with the averages of how much a task is supposed to take. So action points in development are comprised of development lifecycle points for the developer team, which are, and the objective is to finish the deck of tasks before the end of the game. So I said 8, it's 9 per turn, bad. And for the security team, you would have security action points, which are, of which the objective is to buff everything. So either configure firewalls, etc. Against attacks. And on selecting a card, you would roll a d20, so one of these dice, and apply the appropriate modifiers. And if the calculated value is greater than the marked value, then your task costs less, and otherwise it costs more. The reason for this is that you're going to need to be lucky in order to finish, which is an underrated component of project management, is sometimes you get unlucky. So that's the whole point of the die. And finally, a small touch on modifiers. I have mentioned modifiers during the course of this. When you have a roll, depending on your stat block at the beginning and the stat as mentioned, you gain a negative or positive modifier to your roll, which happens. So you roll a dice, you get a value, you apply said modifier, and that's the final value you're looking for. And this for contrary hinders you from in your rolls. There we go. And so in general, how this would go would be that we would have 16 or 20 people in a room, and in the Zoom call or in the meeting, they would all get separated into their own rooms. They would not interact because otherwise they would be able to anticipate what they are doing or what each other is doing. And the idea is to keep them as isolated as possible. And at the end, we would do a debriefing or a recap of what has happened during the session to be able to see how some groups have either buffed too strongly at one time, debuffed too strongly at another time, or put themselves in crux positions. Is basically how this is supposed to go. And also it's a fun alternative to spending an hour rolling dice. So that's it for the presentation. Denise? I think we've lost Denise.
I think we may have lost Dennis. Do you want to give examples of sort of what we would be doing in the next session, maybe? I don't know if you have it or whether that gives too much away.
Honestly, I could. Like, for example, right now, so I'm going to just go to my local game cards because they are going to load way faster than, let's say, another thing. So for the moment, we have 14 developer cards, which is fine enough for a 1 hour session. If we're doing a 2 hour session, which is, let's say, the preferred way of doing this, after having built this up, we would have a few more. And the idea is that you build up your flow at the beginning of the session, where you have some cards that have some requirements. For example, you need, before you draw your various UML diagrams, to perform a use case analysis to be able to determine how you are going to what the things you are going to do, how the things you are going to do, are going to help your effort. There we go. And how these will affect the end user. Words, what do they mean? For example, then you have a drawing diagrams. So this would be, for example, in your project would be a series of UML diagrams, for example, that would show how you would go about your task. And since this is also an IoT based session, you would design some circuitry, which would then have as effect to take various input from sensors and do something with it. And from this, you would prototype some form of firmware that would do something with the circuitry you're using or the components you're using. And parallel to this, you would be able to request some equipment. So some few VM instances, some continuous integration runners, an IoT testing hub, so things I went through in my talk yesterday. And doing this doesn't cost that much, doing the request, but it is something that takes an entire turn to be done because it depends on another team doing it, which is which means an entire turn needs to go. For example, setting up a DevSecOps pipeline does require some equipment, which is why you would do the requesting the equipment at the beginning. Here we also see that some of the scores, some of the modifiers work on averages. For example, if you have a development modifier and a security modifier, if you're doing a DevSecOps pipeline, you're going to want to calculate the average of both. So if I have +3 to dev and +1 to sec, I'm going to only have a +2 to my overall modifier. This is actually quite important because you can't just rely on one thing in development. You can't just have people that are mono-skilled in teams like this. So that's kind of where that narrative takes place. For example, yes, setting up Kubernetes clusters for your deployment. Fine, that also takes an entire turn to be done. So of course you can do multiple cards per turn, but one of these is only going to be active after the next turn has finished, which means you can't do cards that rely on this specific card at the turn where you're playing this specific card. I don't know if that made sense. Building Docker Compose files, same. You wouldn't actually need any reasoning or any requirements to do this, but you would need a little bit of knowledge. So maybe you would need your diagrams, in which case the requirements on this card are wrong. Happens. Oh yeah, setting up an authentication provider because you don't want to throw your IoT out in the world without any form of authentication or authorization, like what we viewed yesterday in the talk. So you, of course, to do this, you would need a form of proxy, which would then run on your Kubernetes cluster, which would require it to have already been done on the turn. And you see how this actually builds the entire flow of the development thing. Then you're like, okay, yeah, I have all this. Let me set up a backend. Okay, this takes a bit of time. Prototyping a device. Hey, I have now a device that I can go contact my backend with my device because I have some form of authentication. This might take some time, but we have a device and we can get it to communicate with the backend. And oh, I want a front-end app to be able to view what I'm doing. So of course, I also need authentication for this to be able to view the data that I'm looking at, that I'm generating. And then, oh, maybe I'd want to link them both together because, kind of what we do with front ends and back ends, link them together. And so all of this kind of gives you a flow. But one of the things you'll notice is that you only have a certain number of points that you can do per turn. And the reason for that is we calculate a certain number of max turns per session. And the idea is it's going to have to force you to knock down certain development branches in order to get your product shipped on time, which is the one thing you don't want to do, and which is the one thing that IoT suppliers do very often. They renege on certain crucial details in order to push things on time, because they either don't have the skill or they had the misfortune of not being able to do things in a certain sense of time, and that's what the dice does. Because if you just react on cards and just say, hey, but yeah, I had this, then no one knows if you're fabulating. But if you have a dice, you don't know if whether or not you're being successful, because unless you load your dice, but then it's no fun. So yeah, so that would be, for example, development. And so to give like an alternative path, the threat side to it is a little bit different. For example, hey, a very easy way to get into something is, oh yeah, social engineering IT support. Maybe. because I am having some render issues on this card. Never mind that. Because, hey, you're going to need a pretty high charisma score. Or you're going to need to know something about that IT support engineer that you're contacting. And maybe they'll reset your password, which is a use case we had like not 2 weeks ago, where attackers got into a service by requesting a password request. I think was Electronic Arts, and then we were able to see a ton of stuff, including video game development files. So spicy. And so that gives you a +3 to attempt to gain a shell, which would be having a shell on some server. Or you could also OSINT a target, like let's say a manager or a developer or a security and would need to do a saving throw in order to succeed, which is why security teams can only do threat teams can only do one action per turn, because they need to know whether or not their action succeeded before continuing. And then, they could attempt network recon. And here we come into the notion of presence, is when they start doing things that are a little bit too, let's say, noisy. They get, let's say, a knock of an additional score of presence, which starts at 0, right? And the more presence they have, the easier it is going to be for security to detect them and to then launch a counter operation, which then is another set of cards. Because the idea would then be to throw them out of the network and to patch their way of entry. For example, say, so phishing campaigns, port scan, and service discovery. Hey, maybe that's going to make logs look a little bit weird. So increases presence. Attempting to pop a shell, well, once more, increases presence. The thing is that you might not succeed at this. So the more you try, the more your presence increases. And that's kind of the plus and minus of it, is you need to be really lucky, or well, skilled and lucky, I guess, to be able to get there. Privilege escalation, same thing. If you use something, let's say a GUID exploit to be able to escalate your privilege, well, if you didn't read correctly, you might have just tried the wrong exploit, and that's going to be logged somewhere. So, same issue. And once you have an escalated, you have root on a machine, well, you can start getting into a little bit more destructive actions. Like, for example, installing AboveNet on a company's infrastructure. Okay, every turn it's going to increase presence and make it be potentially detected. But each turn is more or less 2 or 3 weeks in real time. So that's already some profit. Attempt to steal company secrets. Well, that's actually what you don't want from, threat actors, and that would directly impact development, because then your development product isn't going to be secret anymore. Attempt to take down infrastructure. Well, if you succeed at that, well, the game ends. The threat actors win. You start at 0. So that's the one finality of the game. One thing that they're supposed to go for. Which does give you an end game for at least one team. And there's also a way to reduce presence. There's just taking a turn where you do nothing. You do nothing, you score a saving throw just to make sure, and that reduces your presence on the network, because you're just staying as silent as possible, but still maintaining presence. So that's kind of another flow of operations for another team. And that's also why you wouldn't want to have them all converge back onto the same meeting room where they can all talk, because you wouldn't want the threat team to know what buffs and debuffs are in place, because that's kind of counterintuitive. So yeah, that's kind of the construct of the game. Of course, this game would be way more practical in, let's say, in reality, with an actual card deck, but it is quite possible virtually. And by next session, the card deck will actually be visible online, as in browsable online, and people will be able to do something with it. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Brilliant. Sounds all very interesting. Dennis, have we got you back yet?
Yeah. This is I was
Yes.
watching the thing. This is really cool, man. Actually, I might have missed. Do you have any plans to actually make this as a physical card thing?
Yes. So I've been since this idea popped into my head not 1 or 2 weeks ago. So I had the general idea when I told you, Katie, to do a card game. I was like, I'm actually going to make this as interesting as possible. And then I started like I bought this card creation software. It's like $40 or something, which allows you to make these a little bit easier, following blueprints and everything. And then I was like, well, now that I'm invested in it, I'm going to talk to my local makerspace where I work at university, and I'll be like, hey, can we like maybe do this and like publish this under some Creative Commons later on, and do something with it? And we're like, yeah. So this is a little bit of a what is this? Incubation data, I guess. But yeah, there are ideas of actually making a physical set out of it, but still have it be playable for free online, or whatever, or print your own cards, I guess. So,
yeah, no, this is really cool, right? Because I think I think for teams, I really like that that ability to to have that dynamic, right? Although I'm gonna watch the video. I think I missed about 20 minutes of it, but I definitely feel that we need to try this next month and see if we can get a bigger crowd, so we can actually see the multi-dynamics of this in play.
yeah,
but
ideally we do it on a 2-hour session, because this does seem to be a lot of information to assimilate in 1 hour.
We can do it in 2 hours. That's not a problem.
Yeah.
Let's think about a good name too, right? Because I feel that we almost like come and play. It needs to be like an instant-driven scenario, right? Because I think maybe you want to pick the scenario, right, that you have in mind that you think works well, and then you almost go instant response, practical exercise. I think we need to sell it like that, right? I think we need to really implement it like that, because that's going to make a big difference, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So cool.
I'm still sharing the screen. Yes.
All right. So we stop the recording.